Okay, we can start with the class. They will find us on the way. So today we are going to continue with our variance analysis, and we're going to look at the further aspects in variance analysis. Remember, in our MAC third level, we always deal with more than one product. So what we are going to look at is the variance analysis for more than one product. But first, before we get there, let's look at reconciling a budgeted profit and actual profit. Right, when we are looking at reconciling budgeted profit and actual profit, remember we have been doing variances. They're now coming. Let me just right, so I was saying when we are reconciling our budgeted profit and actual profit here, it's a matter of saying, let me just check something. Right, I was saying when we are reconciling our budget profit and actual profit, what we are trying to do here is that we have a budgeted profit before we do the variance analysis. So we want now to reconcile this budgeted profit to actual profit using the variances that we have calculated. Remember, in our previous class, we did the sales variance and the cost variances, right? So in these sales variance and cost variances, you will see that if there is a favorable sales variance, then that favorable sales variance is going to increase our budgeted profit. If it is unfavorable, then it's going to reduce our budgeted profit. The same applies to the cost variances. If a cost variance is a favorable cost variance, then it means we have used less than what we were expected. So in that case, it means we need to adjust the budgeted profit to arrive at the actual profit by that favorable cost variance. So that's basically what you will be doing if the question requires you to reconcile budgeted profit and actual profit. You just go to the calculated variances, then you look at sales variances first. If a sales variance is a favorable one, then it means it's going to increase this budgeted profit. If it is an adverse, then it's going to reduce the budgeted profit. So at the end of the day, after you do your reconciliation, you should arrive at the actual profit based on your reconciliation. So in our reconciliation, we use the sales variance and the cost variance. So the essence behind this reconciliation is we have a budgeted profit. Then after we have done our variances, you could see that we are going to have adverse, favorables. So those adverse and favorables are the ones that we are going to use to reconcile the budgeted profit to actual profit, right? So when you are doing your reconciliation, it's very easy. The reconciliation is done by adding the favorable production and sales variance to the budgeted profit and deducting the adverse variance. So which means you will be looking at the variances that you have calculated. Those variances that you have calculated are the ones that you are going to use to adjust this budgeted profit to actual profit. So what you should look at here, I think this is the main point here on this reconciliation. You are going to add the favorable cost variances and the favorable sales variance to the budgeted profit. Then all your adverse variances, you are going to subtract them. So in a question, it's going to be very easy, which means once we are done with the calculation of the sales and the cost variances, so we are now going to reconcile our budgeted profit using our sales variance and the cost variances. So this will now be representing a broad picture to management that explains the reason for any difference between the budgeted and the actual profit. Management can now be able to see why there is a difference between the budgeted and the actual profit, which means they will look at these variances, the sales variance and the cost variances. Right. When you are reconciling, you should look at the point that if an adverse sales variance, if we have an adverse sales variance, then it means we have managed to increase our sales there. So it's going to increase our profit. Then if we have an adverse cost variance, then it means our cost is increased. So in that case, it means an adverse cost variance is going to reduce our budgeted profit because the cost in that case is increased. So that's basically what you will be looking at when you are reconciling your budget and actual profit. Right, I want us to look at this activity so that we can demonstrate using this activity. They say LMN has calculated the following variances. In some of the questions, you will be required to first do the calculation for the variances. But in some of the questions, you will be provided with the variances that are already calculated. It depends on the question. So in our case here, we have the variances that are already calculated. So these are the variances that we have. Then they go and say the budgeted contribution for the period was 116,000. See, this is the budgeted contribution, and the actual contribution was 103,000. Do you see the budgeted contribution here is higher than the actual contribution? So we need to reconcile what led to this decrease in this contribution, which means it comes from these variances. And mostly what decrease your contribution is these adverse variances. This is what is going to decrease your contribution. The adverse variances, they are the ones that are going to decrease your contribution. Right, so let's look at how do we, what are we required to do? They say present the variance in a statement which reconciles the budgeted and actual contribution. So when you are reconciling your budgeted and actual contribution, so you just come here and saying reconciling right. So we want to reconcile the budgeted and actual contribution. So when you are reconciling, it means you start from, remember we want to reconcile the budgeted. So which means we are going to start from the budgeted contribution. So we start from the budgeted contribution. So our budgeted contribution as per our question is 116,000. That's the budgeted contribution. Right, when you have your budgeted contribution, remember we are trying to reconcile the budgeted and actual contribution. So you need now to look at the sales. First, you need to adjust your sales variances. So let's look at the sales volume contribution variance. This one, the sales volume contribution. So our sales volume contribution is adverse, that is 14,500 adverse. So this 14,500 is adverse. So you need to subtract it. Then you look also at another sales. There is a sales price variance here, which is the 8,750. So you take the sales price variance. Your sales price variance is 8,750. It's favorable. So what is important when you are answering your questions is this adverse favorable. It's very important when you are answering this kind of a question. So this one is 8,750. It's favorable. So let's look at the adjustment based on the sales price variance, which means we are going to subtract here 116 and minus 14 plus 8,750. How much are we going to get all in all? So if we subtract here, how much are we going to get? We subtract and add.
110,250.
Correct.
So we are going to have 110,250 here. And when we have this adjustment for the sales variances, then you can now go to your cost variances. You can now go to your cost variances. So you look at your cost variances. In our cost variance, we have direct material price, it's adverse, 1954 is adverse. So we have our direct material price variance. It's adverse, so which means you are going to subtract it. In adverse, you subtract it. The reason why you subtract an adverse is it's going to reduce your profit here because there has been an increase in the cost. So which means you need to subtract it. Right, then we go and look at the other one is direct material usage. It's also adverse. Direct material usage is 580. It's also adverse, so which means we're going to subtract this one. Then we also have direct labor. It's favorable, 4361. So we also have the direct labor is favorable, which is 4361. So favorable, you add it. I think you guys, you got the reason why we add and why we subtract. It's a favorable, which means we have used less than the budget. So it's going to increase our profit because we have used less than the budget. So it's going to increase our profit. Then let's look at another one, which is variable direct labor efficiency. It's 168, which is also favorable. So this one was direct labor rate. So let's do the direct labor efficiency. We say the direct labor efficiency is 168, which is also favorable. So a favorable, you add it. I think the reason, we now know what the reason why we should add it. Right, then let's look at the variable production overhead. The variable production overhead expenditure. It's adverse, which is unfavorable. The variable overhead expenditure. It's so this one is adverse, so which means it's going to reduce our profit. Then the last one is going to be the variable overhead efficiency variance, which is favorable. Which is favorable, it's 56. Right, so we're done with all of them, all of the transactions. So what we are going to do now is to reconcile to actual profit. So which means we should have the actual contribution. We want to reconcile it to actual contribution. So it's going to be actual So we have to add and subtract what is to be added and what is to be subtracted. So which means now we can start here and subtract what is to be subtracted. But what I want us to understand more is why do we subtract them and why do we add them? That's the main point, so that even if you encounter any kind of a question, you know exactly what you are supposed to do. Remember, I always say this, we should understand the reason why we are doing something, especially at third level, so that even if a question is complicated, but because of your understanding, you can still build something that can give you marks. So let us now have the actual contribution here. Remember, here we're trying to budget, to reconcile budgeted to actual contribution. The reason why we'll have a difference in the actual contribution and the budget is these variances. So your variances, if it is a cost variance, you will see that if it is an adverse, it means it's going to affect, to reduce your profit because there's been an increase in the expenses. That's all what is happening here. And if it is favorable, it means you have reduced your expenses, so it's going to increase your profit. The same applies to the sales variance. That's how we do our reconciliation in the question. So how much are we going to have all in all? We start from here, going down, adding everything that needs to be added and subtract everything that needs to be added. But at the end of the day, we should have this, the one that is given, 103579. Let's just double check if it is correct. But that's the one that if we have a different figure, then it means our calculations are not right. This must be the one that is proper. If you are provided with both of them, then it means you should get the one that is there, the actual contribution. But if it is not there, then it means whatever you get here is what is going to be your actual contribution. Right? So that's how we do our reconciliation. So you don't have to scratch your head too much when you are doing our reconciliation of the budgeted profit to the actual contribution. It's a matter of looking at the variances. It's either you have calculated them or they've already been, but in our questions, they will, I never saw a question for this contribution in our MEC. I think these guys, they've got a lot of areas to ask questions. So you might find that some of the areas, they don't ask them much. But if it happens that we come across a question, then it means that's how we do our contribution. It's simple and straightforward to reconcile. Right? I don't know if there's any one with a question before we go to the next step. Right, I think this is simple and straightforward. So let's look at the other advanced variances that you can come across in your exam. We have direct material mix and yield variances. Right, here now, what is happening here on these mix variances? Remember, when we are making a product, some of the products might require two types of material to make them. I think in most of our questions for MAC costing, you will see that we will have different two types of materials that are going to be used to make the product. So that's where we are going to derive material mix variance. I think we know this mix. The mix is the contribution of each. Let's say here we have Y, X, Z, and the Y, X, Z is going to sell 20, and this one is going to sell 30, and this one is going to sell 50. So you should be able to determine the mix from here. What is going to be the mix? Is there anyone who can still remember how do we calculate the sales mix? So what is going to be our mix on this one, the one that I just showed on the whiteboard? Our mix on this one, the sales mix. We did this when we were doing, what do you call it? Break-even analysis. That's when we did the sales mix. You should be good in
yes, sir.
Yes.
I know we can do it, sir. Is the sale mix will be 235, sir.
Yes, it will be
We
2, 3,
3,
5.
5.
That's
We
correct.
had,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that is going to be our sales mix here, or a material mix. The same, the calculation is the same. Whether it's a sales mix or a material mix, the calculation is the same. So what you are saying here in direct material mix variances and yield variances is that you want to see what is the variance that is going to be caused. Remember, we are going to budget. We are going to have a budgeted mix. So which means we are going to have a budgeted mix. So at the end of the day, we'll have the actual mix. So what you are trying to do here is to see the variance that was caused because of the difference in the budgeted mix and the actual mix. When we use this, you will see at the end of the product that the mix is going to be different based on the budgeted and the actual mix. The actual quantities that are going to be used might be different from what we were expecting. So that is the variance that we will be trying to calculate when we are using 2 or more products. So let's see what these guys say on the direct mix variance. They say it arises where 2 raw materials are combined to produce a unit. It's still the same like how we were doing the variance, but the only difference now is we have 2 raw materials. We are now using 2 raw materials to make a product. So once we use 2 raw materials, then it means a mix is going to be to arise there. Right. So the input standards should be established. We always start with our standard. This is our budget, so that we can indicate the target mix of material required to produce a unit. Right? Then we are now going to determine the cost of different materials are estimated, and a standard mix is determined based on the material mix that minimize the cost per unit of output but still meet the quality requirement. So in your mix now, you will see you have determined this standard. So at the end of the day, your standard will not be the same like the actual. So that's where the mix variance is going to come. So which means you are now going to look at your actual units that were used and the standard units that were used. But you are now using in mix in proportions. So which means the only difference from what we were doing is now these mix proportions. Then they say by computing a mix and yield variances, we can provide an indication of the cost of deviating from the standard mix. So which means since we already have our predetermined mix, and when we get our actual, then it means that's where the variance is going to come. Right, so let's look at the material mix variance on its own without the yield variance. They say it arises when the mix of material used differ from the predetermined mix. So which means the actual mix is different from the predetermined mix. That's when we have a material mix variance. Then they say if the mixture is varied so that a larger than standard proportion of more expensive material is used, there will be unfavorable variance. What they are saying here is in your budget, if it happens that the actual is now absorbed expensive materials in the mix, more of the expensive material in the mix, then it means you are going to have an unfavorable variance in that case. The same applies to here, it's going to be vice versa, right? Then they say here we have a material yield variance. I don't know why I didn't put a formula on this material mix variance, but we're going to have the formula when we do the activity. Right, then the material yield variance, this one arises because it's still the same. The only difference between the material mix variance and the material yield variance, this one is now going to compare the output. That's the only difference, but the way we do the calculation is the same. But material yield variance is now going to measure the variance in standard output and actual output attained. So you can see we're still doing the same way like what we're doing in those single product. Remember what we did in our previous work was for a single product and a single material that is going to be used to make a product. So now the adjustment that we are now going to do is a situation where we're going to use 2 or more materials to make a particular product, right? So that's the formula for here, actual yield minus standard yield from actual input of material times standard cost per unit. So that's how you calculate your material yield variance. The same applies to your material price, material material mix variance. So which means even when you are doing your material mix variance, you are going to have your actual mix minus the standard mix times standard cost per unit of output. So that is going to be your formula. But I always want us to present with a calculation that is going to demonstrate exactly what you are talking about. So let's look at this one. So if there is anyone who will be having, who will be behind on this, then we'll see from the calculation that we are going to do. So let's look at the activity. They say the standard variable cost for manufacturing 1 bag of Dog's Choice, a popular vet endorsed dog food is as follows. This is the standard. When you are reading your questions, always look at information. This is the standard, right? Then we now have the actual purchase of raw materials and issued to production for the month of June were as follows. So this is the standard. So the standard says 12 kg of oil and 8 kg of grow at 15 Rand. So this is now going to be the actual, which means for well and for grow. Then we are required to calculate the direct material mix variance. We are required to calculate the direct material mix variance. So if the question requires you to calculate the direct material mix variance, so here we're going to calculate the direct right. When you are calculating your direct material mix variance, it means the first thing is for you to start with your formula. You need to start with your formula. That's the first thing every time when you are doing your question. You start with your formula. So your formula is going to be, what is going to be the formula for this one? From what we have just did, anyone with How are we going to build our formula? Are you guys there?
Yes, we are there.
So how are we going to build our formula? So our formula is going to be actual quantity in standard mix proportion times, or not times, sorry, where is my, we're not gonna times there, sorry, we're going to minus, sorry, it's not times, it's minus actual quantity remember actual quantity, they are already in actual mix. So there is no need for you when you are answering your question to calculate the mix for when you are dealing your actual quantity, because you still get the same figure because they are already in. So you need to calculate here actual quantity in standard mix proportion minus actual quantity, then times standard cost. So that's how you build your formula. And when you are doing mix variances, it's mostly advisable to use a table when you are doing your mix variances. It's mostly advisable to use a table. So how many columns do we need here in this table? So we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we are going to need 5 columns. Right, so we have these two products. So this place is going to be small. Let me just add something. So here you are going to have your actual mix, actual quantity in standard mix. I'll just shorten our actual quantity in standard mix. Then you are going to have your actual quantity. Then here you are going to have the variance, that is going to be the difference in quantity. Right, then you should also have your standard cost. Then you now have your mix variance. Right, so I think that's how the table, even though I shorten actual quantity in standard mix. I think the only portion that need you guys to understand is this one, the actual quantity in standard mix. So what you do is when you are doing the actual quantity in standard mix, you will go to the question and look at the standard mix. Our standard mix is here. There is going to be 12 kg of well and 8 kg of grow. So that is going to build our standard mix. And our actual quantity that we issued is going to be here. So we are going to have actual quantity in standard mix proportion. So what we need is a total for this part so that we can use our mix to share. So what is going to be the total here? It's 10,015, right? So what do you do now? You are going to use your standard mix to share. So which means we come here. So the grow is going to have, let's start with well. Then we have grow. So it's 8. It's 12 for well and 8 for grow. So what you now do is you are now going to say 12 for well. So it's going to be 12 over 20 times 10,050. That is for well. Then for grow, it's going to be 8 over 20 times 10,050. So that is going to be your actual quantity in standard mix proportion. So how much are we going to have for each there? How much are we going to have? Is 12 divided by 20.
6,030.
6,030 for here is going to be 6,030. And this one, I think it's the difference now. The difference. It's just a matter of subtracting. So these are going to be your actual quantity in standard mix proportion. So you come and fill them here. For well, it's going to be 6,030 is our calculation 1. Then for grow, it's 4,020. It's our calculation 2, right? Then you have your actual quantity in standard mix proportion. Your standard mix proportion will come from here. When we talk of a mix proportion, which means this is what is going to go into this bag of dog food. There is going to be 12 kg of well and 8 kg of grow. So these are the two materials that are going to be used to make this product. So you now need to determine the mix. So your mix is going to be determined by here. There is going to be 12 kg, there is going to be 8 kg, right? Once you are done there, then the next thing is to copy and paste the actual. Remember here they say the actual purchase of raw materials. Here we are talking of material. They were talking of material mix variance, which means we will be looking at the material that was used. We are not talking of the material that was purchased here. we are looking at the material that has gone into the product. So that's where the material mix variance is going to come. We were budgeted to use here, and then we now use here. So we're going to take 6,100 for well and 3,950 for grow. So it's going to be 6,100 here and 3,000 3,950 here, right? So we can now look at the difference. But before we go to the difference, what are going to be our difference? Are they going to be favorable or unfavorable in the first one? Anyone who has got an idea there? It's still the same like what we were doing before. Who can determine whether it's favorable or unfavorable here? No one. Are we lost or what? Is it that we are a bit lost on this thing? Well, the same variances that we were doing. Remember, this is going to be our standard mix in the actual mix. And it's a cost variance, this one. So which means we were budgeting for 6,030 and we now come and use 6,100. So in all, it means our variance is going to be unfavorable.
Unfavorable. It was way more than what we were expecting, sir.
Yes. So it's still the same. It's just that now we are dealing with two materials. But if you revert back to what we have been doing, you can see that it's still more or less the same. Right. So let's look at what is going to be the difference. 6,100 minus 6,030. So this one is going to have 70, which we say is unfavorable. Then you look at the standard cost. What is the standard cost? For well, it's 5 rand, and for the other one, it's 15. Right. So which means our standard cost here is going to be 5, and here it's going to be 15. So let's also look at here. Here you can see it's favorable, this one. It's going to be favorable because the standard is less than the actual. So it's going to be 420 minus 3950. So this one is also giving me 70. I don't know if my calculator is, but this one is now favorable. Right. So if you go back to our notes, you will see that if you use more, this one is going to be a favorable one. So which means we use more of grow. So let's look at what is going to be the mix variance. So your mix variance now is going to multiply this times this one is now going to give you your mix variance. So which means it's 70 times 5, it's 350. And this one is unfavorable, which is adverse. Then you multiply 70 now by 15. This one is going to give us 1,050, which is favorable, ne? So you should have your total here. So in your total, you have a favorable of 1,050. You just subtract 1,050 minus 350. So which means at the end, you are going to have 700, which is favorable. Right. I don't know if there's anyone with who need to more clarification on this calculation. If there is anything that you guys feel like you don't get it. That's how we do our mixed variances. It's still going back to what we were doing. If you check what we're doing here, when we say actual quantity in standard mix proportion, if you guys can still remember what we were doing when we were calculating the cost variances, we were using the actual quantity with the standard price. If you can still remember what we're doing. So which means here now we're now using the actual quantity in standard mix. So which means what is going to be in standard is going to be the mix proportion. That is going to be the standard. So that's basically how you calculate your mix variance, which means you should first determine the mix in the question. The mix is very easy. It's a matter of what will go into the product. That's the mix. Here, the mix is 12 kg of oil and 8 kg. So which means that's what goes into the product. So that's where you determine the mix variance. Right? I don't know if there's anyone with a question on this part. Or we're still digesting right? If there's no question on this one, let's do also this. Remember, we also have the sales mix and sales quantity variance. It's still the same, like what we have done there. A sales mix. So if it is a sales mix, we are looking at the actual sales mix being different from the budgeted sales mix. So which means it's the same like what we have done on the first one. So the first thing is your mix. What is my mix, my sales mix in the question? Then you apportion that sales mix to the actual quantities. Then you now determine the difference between the budgeted sales mix and the actual sales mix, like what we have done there. But the only difference here is you are now dealing with two products. That's the only difference with what we used to do. Here you are now dealing with two products, which means you are dealing with two or more products, right? So they say it arises when a company sells several different products. Sales mix variance measure the impact arising from the actual sales mix being different from the budgeted sales mix. Then here we can measure variance from margin contribution or a profit margin. I think you guys, you from our previous class, the difference between the margin contribution and the profit margin. Who can still remember the difference between the contribution margin and the profit margin?
I think in the contribution margin, we don't consider the fixed elements or cost elements, and then
Yes,
the
then
profit margin,
so which means here we'll be using the variable cost, and here we'll be using the absorption. So what sometimes what can happen is if in a question, let's say you are provided with the profit margin, then you should know that they use absorption costing, but they want you to use the contribution margin, but they give you the profit margin. it means you are going to remove the fixed cost element in this profit margin so that you can now have your contribution margin. That is, if the question requires you to do a contribution margin and you are provided with a profit margin. So in that case, it means you are going to remove the fixed element in here so that you can have a contribution margin. It's still vice versa. If you are given a contribution margin and you are required to use in your calculation the profit margin, then it means you need to add to this contribution that fixed element which is not there so that you arrive at your, so that's basically how some of the questions might be structured. Right, so let's look at the formula, the sales quantity, the actual sales minus actual sales quantity in budgeted proportion times the standard margin. So it's still the same like the first one, which means we're going to have the actual minus actual quantity in budgeted proportion, which means here you need now to determine the sales mix. You need to determine your sales mix so that you can see your quantities in budgeted proportion. Right, so let's look at, I think there's a question that I have that I want us to demonstrate this sales mix variance. And they say the budgeted sales for the Milano company for a period where these are the budgeted sales. So we have budgeted here. And we have the actual sales. Right? Then the question requires us to calculate the sales mix variance. The sales mix variance. Where do we start? It's still more or less the same like what we have been doing. So where do we start here? So which means our formula is going to be who here? Calculate the sales mix variance. So which means we need our actual sales quantity minus in budgeted proportion. Right? What else do we need? Then we need the difference. No, so I'm now writing the table. Okay, it's still fine. Actual sales quantity minus actual sales in budgeted proportion. Then we multiply by standard contribution. Then we have our sales mix. Okay. So which means here we can have right. So our actual sales quantity, we have two. Let's check the question. We have product X, Y, Z. So we have 3 products here. We have product X, right. So the first thing that we need, okay, I think I should check. Let me just remove some. So we should have a column for this. So we have 3 products. That is going to be product X, Y, Z. That is going to be X here, then Y, Z. So let's start with the easier part, which is going to be the actual sales quantity. There's going to be the actual sales quantity is going to be 6,000, 7,000, and 9,000. 6,000, 7,000, and 9,000. Right? Then we need to determine the actual sales in budgeted proportion. So we need to look at the budgeted proportion. I think they gave us here. Budgeted sales in budgeted proportions here it's going to be 40%, 35%, and 25%. So that is going to be our sales mix. So when we determine our actual sales in budgeted proportion, then it means we come here. Our total actual sales is 22,000. So we want to share this 22,000 so that we can have our actual sales in budgeted proportion. So there's 40, 35, and 20. So let's do a separate calculation and see product X, Y, Z. So product X is going to have 40% times 22,000, and product Y is going to have, what's the percentage again? It's going to have 35. 35% times 22,000. Then product Z is going to have 25% times 22,000. So what is going to be our actual quantity in standard mix proportion for the first one? So it's going to be 22,000 times 40%. So this one is going to be 8,800. Then that one,
7,700.
sorry,
7,700.
7,700. Then the other one is going to be how much?
5,500.
5,000. So this is going to be our standard proportion in actual quantities. So we're going to have, the first one is going to be 8,800. The second one is going to be 7,700. Then the third one is going to be 5,500. Right, so we need now to determine the difference. But first, before you determine the difference, it's easy to look at okay, I should have a column. You should look at here. This is the actual sales quantity. This is the budget. So the difference here is going to be 2,800, which is what, unfavorable or favorable? Is it favorable or unfavorable?
It's unfavorable.
Yeah, your volume is very low.
It's unfavorable.
So we are going to have unfavorable here. And here also is unfavorable. And here it's going to be how much the difference? $3,500. So is it favorable? This one is favorable. Yes, it's favorable. Then we now need the standard contribution. So let's look at the standard contribution per each product is 20, 12, and 9. That's the standard contribution. So which means it's easier now. We can determine our sales mix variance by multiplying. The first one is 2,800 times 20. Uh, 56,000. It's unfavorable. Let me just put it in bracket. Then the second one is 700 times 12.
92,400.
8,400. It's also unfavorable. Then the third one is going to be 3,500 times 9. 31,000. This one is favorable. Right. So at the end, you should have your total. Your total variance. So which means I think we have more adverse here. So let's add the adverse and subtract the favorable. Then we'll have the adverse. So it's going to be 56 plus 8,400 minus 31,000. So we are going to have 32,000 we're going to have 32,900. It's unfavorable, so it's going to be adverse. Right, so which means that's how you do your sales mix variance. That's how we do our sales mix variance. So which means the main work is, and it's advisable to do it in table because you are going to add these variances for each product to come up with the total. So it's advisable to do it in a table format. Right, so I don't know if there's anyone with a question on this sales variance. Okay, I think when you guys are quiet, it means you are fine. Right, so that's all. I think in our next class, we are going to look at a new topic, which is going to be, I think we're left with 2 topics now. So it's going to be relevant costing. Whereas we need to do relevant costing and budgeting to cover all the topics for test 1. So in our next class, we're going to look at relevant costing. Then we'll also cover budgeting. These are not very long topics and they are straightforward topics. We can still be able to finish them in one class. Each one can be done in one class. So I will ask you guys to go and look at relevant costing. That's our next topic for the next class. I don't know if there's anyone with a question. If there is no question, then today's class was a bit short. We're gonna end the class. Right, so I'll end the class for now and we'll meet in the other classes. I think tomorrow, those who are doing AIN, you'll do your AIN tomorrow. But I'm not sure you guys, the Easter holiday, but I don't think there will be classes or during the Easter holiday. We'll announce it in the group because the year modules, there is no break, so there is no need for us to do the classes during the holiday, because in the year module you'll find that there is no break. We can only have a break during the holidays, and yeah, that's the only break that we have in the year module. So we won't be having classes during the holiday so that we can have a short break. Unless there's anyone with a question, I'm gonna close the class. Okay, so which means there's no question, so I'm gonna close the class.
Thank you, sir. Have a good holiday.
Yeah, you guys, you can enjoy your holiday. Drive safely, don't drink and drive.
Yes.
Don't drink and drive.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Yeah. Because drinking and driving, people just say there's a lot of accident. It's because people are very excited. We have too much time to drink. We spend the whole night drinking. Tomorrow you need to drive. So that's why we normally have a lot of accidents. Okay, enjoy your Easter, guys. Enjoy your Easter holiday.
Thank you.